So this is a video I wanted to do for a while on how to actually build the drift car in Forza Horizon 4. I think the main point of this is to bridge the gap that's left behind by other tutorial videos. I learned everything I need to do this myself through other tutorials, but I always noticed there was something really important was always skipped over, not fully explained. I always wanted to know more. So that's what I'm trying to do here. Hopefully by the end of this you will understand the in-game settings that transcend just Forza, and you can use these hopefully in any other car games. So this should be fully comprehensive. So let's just get straight into step one, choosing your car. I know this is a personal choice, you might have a car in mind, but for the purposes of learning the core mechanics and setup, I recommend choosing something with relatively low power and a car that's going to be a bit longer in shape. This is important. If we start with a lower power, we can add power where we see fit, and it gives us a nice base to begin molding the perfect drift car. It's also important that with a longer car we can force all of the weight to the back of the car, so the likes of your Sylvias and that, you can force all the weight into the back so that when you swing it swings. If you're trying to start learning with the likes of a Golf or something small, you're not really going to have that length to kind of work with, so we're going to go for something longer. The idea is to have it swing like a pendulum, so you want the front of your car to be nice and stable, you want the back of it to be kind of soft, so that all the weight forces to the back kind of at a downwards angle, so you have the front of the car raised and the back of it lowered, so naturally all your weight will just go right back there. I'm going to start with a Skyline GTR V-Spec. I would recommend buying a car of similar shape to learn the basics. We'll turn it into a drift machine. If you want to choose the same one and kind of do the things at the same time with me, work away. So just take note there, comes standard with 278 brake horsepower with a balance of 56%. It's important to keep in mind that you always work right there where it says the front, you want that to be as close to 50%. As close to 50% as possible. It means it'll be perfectly symmetrical and balanced and weight to power. Will help it drift a bit smoother. Once you've bought your car, it's time for step two. So the very first upgrade you want to do is to ensure that your car is converted to a rear wheel drive drivetrain swap. It's also important to note that you can drift in an all-wheel drive car, but I feel for learning the basics and mechanics you should start here, as it will give you a good base of information to progress with the car in any way that suits you. You can take all of these all this advice and apply it to an all-wheel drive car once you get your bearings, but I feel like you should always start learning how to drift and how to set up a drift car rear-wheel drive. So once that's done, we move on to platform and handling. These options all unlock the options to tune the car later on, so we need to buy the far right option in each of these categories. The reason we need the drift springs is so we can get access to the maximum steering angle. Steering angle is something that is important in every car, so some cars turn their wheels more or less depending on why the car was made originally. This means that there are some cars with a larger angle, so when we add the drift springs we get actually access to a greater angle. The wheels will be able to turn more. So the roll bars we will upgrade will come into play whenever we're distributing the weight from the front of the car to the back. What we're going to do is tighten the springs in the front of the car to create stability in the front, and at the back we want to soften the wheels so that when we swing around all the weight will actually compress down to the back and keep all of that weight in one place. The only one thing we don't need to purchase fully is the added weight. This is because we want to allow the car to remain light so it can maintain speed. After this we want to move on to the drivetrain options. We begin with the clutch, which we want to have the best option here on the right so that we can change gear depending on need at the time, and we want that to happen as instantly as possible, so the better your clutch, the quicker your gear is going to change. The next is the transmission. Here we want the furthest right option. This is really important because it will help us actually unlock gear ratio tuning, which I'll explain later on. Then we're going to upgrade the driveline to its fullest. This is a general performance option, isn't fully necessary, but I still would recommend upgrading it. The final option is the differential. This is where the car actually transforms into a drifting car. This is essential to whether the car will actually slide. Differential is basically it's between the two wheels at the back. I don't know if it's at the front as well, but it's just keep in mind for the back anyway. So for example, if the car is sliding out, the differential allows the wheels usually to rotate at different speeds. So if one's spinning too much and slipping out, the inside wheel will turn less, and it'll allow it to regain control by catching grip and making sure everything's not just completely sliding out. We don't want this at all. So what we want to do is what's called locking the diff, if you've heard that expression before. This means that the back wheels will spin at the same rate, so when you accelerate, it's a shared rotation for the back wheels, so we don't pick up any additional grip that we don't need. I can add a clip in of this car later on without the diff lock, kind of show you what that difference really makes. Next we get into tires and rims. I recommend going for the street tire compound for lower horsepower builds and a sport tire compound for the higher horsepower builds. Actually later on I will remove them and show you how much slippier and how much less grip this gives you. In hindsight, I probably would have just kept the standard wheels, but I'll show you that later. So that's all about grip, so you know your front wheels won't spin out with getting too much grip and stopping the slide. Next we want to make sure the front wheels are wider than the back wheels. To do this, go to the following two options by increase the front track width and increasing the front tire width. I would usually only move on to tire size kind of once or twice. I would usually only bump it up once or twice, and the back tires I always leave the same so that they don't get too grippy. Next we can move into engine upgrades. Here I would only recommend upgrading a few options. Usually the camshafts and valves, I would bind them up to the fullest, and I'll bump up the twin turbo as well a little bit just to get that extra horsepower in there. We're looking for around the 500-600 mark, which is where I feel you should start. All the power after 500 or 600 horsepower makes it really easy to drift, and I understand that might be what you're looking for, but I feel like if you want to master this, really, if you really want to get good at high speed drifting, I feel like you should master low horsepower drifting and make sure you understand how the car works, and then you can just work away and beat away with whatever you want after that. So you'll notice at this point the displacement has now hit 51%, which is much closer to the sweet spot for a balanced car, which is great. This mostly finishes step 2. From here we get a great base so we can get into tuning. We can play around with appearances like spoilers, hoods, wheels, choose whatever suits you best. It's completely personal preference, and confidence in your car, making it look nice, will actually help you out a lot, because if you have a car that you don't like the look of, you're kind of you're not wasting your own time, but you're not going to enjoy it as much, so make it look pretty. Okay, so now we can move into step 3, the big scary tuning stage. This is where things can get a little bit complicated, and I'll try and explain these the best I can. So let's just start from left to right. Tire pressure first. Usually I have a preset of about 34 psi for the front wheels and 26 for the back. This means the front will get more inflated and the back will be less inflated, so you can push more weight into the back because they're softer, and the weight will just naturally sink in there. Lots of people do it different ways. This is just the way I find works best for me. Usually I'll end up changing it later, just tweaking it to see if I can get any better results. It's kind of works similarly to how the diff would work in terms of grip, so it is important, but you can always fool around with that and see what comes back to you. Next we get into gearing, which is much harder to explain, so I'm going to actually explain this if I can. I don't actually know how gears work in real life. I understand how to drive a car and all that, but I can explain it in terms of what will hopefully make sense to you here. So first, look at the cog on the left. It represents the final drive, and the gear on the right represents first gear. If I spin the final drive gear slowly, the effect on the first gear is that it'll spin slowly, right? So if I spin the final gear drive spinal drive. Oh. So if I spin the final drive gear fast, then we can expect the first gear to spin fast too. This effect's carried down to first, second, third gear, and so on. So if we take the final drive here and increase it to 4.1, then we see all the gear lines below begin to bunch up. This graph represents how quickly the car can get through each gear. The closer they are, the quicker the car will accelerate through each gear. You're looking for each gear to be nicely spread out, and you'll see on the graph there, just maybe round out each gear to the nearest 0.1. This will be a good base to get started, and you can come back to this if we see problems later. That's what tuning's about. You set your base tune, you go out, you drive it, you come back and you tune it. Next, in alignment, I personally ignore this section. I feel like I can get great cars without messing around with this too much, so I don't really worry. The next option is the anti-roll bars. A good general rule of thumb here is that you want your car at the front to be nice and stiff, and at the back you want it to be soft, so you can follow the theme with the rest of the car. So far it means we can keep the front wheel stable and the back of the car soft and lower, meaning all the weight will just sink right back in there and you can really swing it around. A cheap way to do these settings is to grab the front and push the bar just under the letters ST in stiffness, and grab the rear and push it down to letters FT in soft, something in and around these values. Next is the springs, and we're going to repeat the previous process here and follow the same rules for front stiffness and rear softness. Once again, this is to push the weight to the back of the car. As for ride height, personally I like the front high as possible. You always want the back to be low as possible so the car sits at an angle to allow the back to be heavy and the front to have its maximum control. Damping is the same process, although here try to keep the front and rear values at the top of the bottom symmetrical. As you go for 17 in the front and 5 or 5.5 in the back. Aero will remain locked in unless you're using a body kit that has it. I don't really personally like the body kits that have the aero options, so it'll always be locked for me. You can put it on. If you do put them on, I recommend just leaving them as they are. And finally we get into the differential that I talked about earlier. So to lock the diff, we set both of these values to 100. This means they will all spin at the same speed. They won't differ from each other to retain any grip. It'll just keep spinning both the wheels at the same speed. So here I notice that moving into fourth gear loses all its revs. What would I do to fix that? We want fourth gear to have less of a range, so we can go to the tuning and look at fourth gear fits in relation to the third and fifth. When I do this, I notice the fourth gear is not that actual far away, so I'll only change it a little bit. I come out of this, it's not my smoothest line here, but hopefully you get what I'm trying to show. We'll now compare that with a much higher final drive and see what kind of results I get. So by increasing my final drive, it's helped a lot here. If I was to increase the horsepower, if I was to increase the horsepower of the car, I would then lower the final drive just to keep it balanced. It still feels super grippy, so we'll try and change a few things here and see what results I get. And as you can probably tell, all I need to do is reduce the tire compound. It was way too grippy. It's always it is much more slippy to the point where I can take off in fourth gear. As you can see, I get to about second gear, my car completely stops here. We can once again head to the tuning string, and like I thought, there's too much of a gap. There's 0.9 between first and second gear, so let's try and close that gap and filter the other gears down. You can see here it's a lot quicker. So, and we want to go on then to mystery step 4. This is the most important of all, so please don't forget this. Make sure that your braking, stability and traction control are all off in your settings. These will not allow you to drift properly if you have them on. The car will grip to the road, it will not slide. Well, it will slide, but nowhere near to the extent that it should. I also recommend driving in manual or manual with clutch. If you want a clutch kick, I don't bother with it as I can work without it, but some people will tell you it's really important. Once again, personal preference. But the utmost important thing is to remember to have fun and not to forget that it's all a learning experience. Creating, upgrading, tuning a drift car is a personal experience, and you can use your car. You can use this tutorial to mold your car your way.